Penny, for inviting me here. I have had more slightly risky environments to speak in. Last May, I went to the annual jamboree of the Gallup Institute to tell them that I thought that scientific sampling was done for, and they weren't terribly happy with the prospect there. I'm sure that most of you remember 1936, the Literary Digest got the election wrong. George Gallup got the election right with a scientific sample and really laid the bedrock for the short lifespan of the scientific survey, as I shall explain. I'm not going to say that all surveys are wrong. In fact, I don't think we should focus on surveys. Nobody wants surveys. Let's go back to what people want. Nobody wants holes. They want drills. Sorry, nobody wants drills. They want holes. Nobody wants surveys. They want the information to be able to make the right decisions and choices and to be informed at the right time. I am not convinced, however, that more data is good. I think we're actually running into a situation now where we're getting more data and it's causing problems with decision making. A lot of commercial companies are cutting back, and Barry Schwartz is talking about this, the paradox of choice. You can have too much data. You want the right information at the right time, at the right level of granularity. That is why, for example, most serious scientists never use more than 2 significant digits. My son is just starting his master's in physics. He rarely uses more than 1 digit. Because the stuff that's interesting, that's important, is at the front end of that number. You change the scale up and down. He only really deals with 2 types of physics. They do cosmological and quantum. He misses out the bit in the middle. Well, that's kind of what we do, isn't it? So nobody really needs surveys. They need information. And it's tricky when you don't have the slide, so I try to use an acronym to remind me of what I want to say. And thinking about this audience, I thought crime would be a good one. So the 5 big problems with surveys, because surveys are sometimes the right answer. If a survey is the right answer, we should use it. But we're beginning to realize that actually a lot of the time it's not a good answer. C, cost. It costs time and it costs money. I spent 28 years until May, and I stood down voluntarily, wasn't kicked out, as a counsellor. And some of the things that we were asked to do were burdensome, got in the way, and were not of benefit to us or our constituents. So that was a practical problem. They also cost money. Now in Nottinghamshire, which is where I live, policing is going to be cut by about 25%. Fire service is going to be cut by about 25%. We can all argue about whether that's right or wrong. But if those 2 are being cut by 25%, I hope to dear God that surveys are cut by more than 25%. Because in the priority list, they come behind those 2. Now, when money is back again, I would hope they go up by more than policing does. Because once you've got enough policemen, you've got enough policemen. Once you've got enough fire engines and fire officers and so on, you've got enough. There's always more interesting information we can have, let's be honest. So cost is something we need to bear in mind, and we should recognise. We shouldn't volunteer, we shouldn't stick our necks up and say, cut us, but we should, in our heart of hearts, recognise that when there are cuts, they should fall more heavily on things like surveys and social studies. Not all of them, and not some of the ones that have been cut. R, response rates. If your response rate is below 70%, you cannot approximate to a random sample and project to the population. You cannot say, this is true of the population at 95% confidence. We've got 1,000 people, we're going to say plus or minus 3%. We've got 100 people, we're going to say plus or minus 10%. No, not true. You could rework it and say, in terms of reliability, if the same 17% who answered that survey answered the next survey, then we would expect it to be this similar. So it's a broken tool. Even the biggest survey we do in the country, the 10-year census, is beginning to be really difficult in some parts of our cities. We just plough on, but then politicians pick up the wrong end of it because they find they don't have enough money because there have been underestimates of people living there, children living there, and so on, because of that survey process. I, intrusiveness. First time I realised this was I was doing a course and I was listening to an interview between 2 Open University ethnographers, and they'd wanted to do a project with African Caribbean seniors in Hackney, and they'd been turned away. And at first they thought, oh, this is outrageous, you're stopping these people. sharing their views with us ethnographers. And so they talked and they said, no, they've been researched to death. They've been on a BBC show. They've had 2 or 3 anthropologists. They've had Rorschach tests. They've had every test. We're just intruding into people's lives too much. We're seeing that with the census. All of a sudden, people are really beginning to object. And we realise, you know, the Human Rights Act has a balance between right to private life and public duty. And we need to always be thinking, whether it's commercial or social, do we have a right to bother them? Is the benefit to society big enough to bother them for that? So we're down to just M and E now. M, methodological issues. If you've not read it yet, read Mark Earle's book, Heard. It talks about how we are really bad witnesses to our own motivations. And he draws on Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, Dan Ariely, predictably irrational. Look at Martin Lindstrom in his biology. You cannot ask people why they do things. They don't know. It's not that they're fibbing by and large. There are some times when it's social acceptability. Go and look at the discursive psychologists, and they will explain to you why people say that they, in schooling, and I noticed on the website today some stuff about schooling in there, and that people are much more motivated towards schools that teach people broad living, and only 25% think exam results matter. And I have to say, as somebody who for 20 years was in charge of where people appealed to put their kids and the battles we had, that wasn't what they did. And so what the discursive psychology say is that there are no such things as attitudes in our heads. Attitudes exist between us in the discourse. As Wittgenstein would say, we've got word games. You throw up that phrase, I give you this answer. You throw up that phrase, I give you this answer. We can go into that more over drinks later. And the last one is epistemological. I hate saying that word from the platform, tricky. But there's a big spectrum. At one end, we have the Vienna Circle positivists who believe there is a real world out there, that the only knowledge that's worth having is hard measurement. And then we have the Foucault postmodernist, post-structuralist, constructionist who say, no, every narrative is equally valid. And most of us live somewhere between the two. But the survey is emphatically in that space. The problem with something like the crime survey is that people treat it as if it was true. And people treat other types of reports of crimes as they're true. There is no single truth. They are all narratives. Some narratives are more useful than others, but none of them are valid in the sense that a different narrative is wrong. And that is a trickier concept for dear simple souls like Pickles to grasp with. So we need to work about how that's going to be put forward. But I would simplify that epistemological change, and it's happening in the private sector as well. We used to say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And then we got a slightly more gender-neutral view of that and said, well, actually, if you can measure it, it probably isn't the important thing. And we do that all the time, particularly in social service. We take something that's really important, and then we try to operationalize it and turn it into something we can measure as if it was a real, tangible thing, and that we can add up the numbers. That 3 of those is worth 1 of them. And it doesn't work that way. So what are the alternatives? Sometimes it's a survey. Sometimes it's not doing the project at all. Sometimes it's right outside of research. You want to know how much cocaine's used in a prison? Measure the metabolates in the sewage. Want to know which days of the week people in Rome use more cocaine? Measure the metabolates. Want to know about the spread of flu in the US? Look at Google for who is searching for flu terms. And they can predict there's going to be an outbreak there in about a week's time because people are starting to search for Lemsip. They're now doing that with Twitter and dengue fever, mapping it faster. In Australia, they're mapping outbreaks of fire because people are reporting news and it's going up a lot faster that way. So people meters, we now record the way that people watch and consume media more and more electronically. Those are choices there. Ethnography. What about mass observation? I was just listening on Radio 4 Extra last night to Nella Last. What a tremendous way of finding out about what is going on in society. There are new techniques coming out where we can enable people to use smartphones to be mass ethnographers. Let's look at some of the alternatives. Let's not assume for any given project that a survey is the right answer. I used to work in computing many, many years ago, and DEC was around then, and they used to answer the phone with the answers of X, which was their main computer. Well, now, what was your question? And I think that researchers, whether they're in the social sector or the private sector, for too long have simply said, well, what survey do we need to solve this problem? So I would suggest it may well be a little damaged, if not endangered.